June 30th, 1956. The skies over the Grand Canyon. Before we uncover the terrifying, unimaginable moment when two massive passenger airliners collided in the vast, empty sky and forever changed the way the world flies, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and like this video. While you do that, let me take you back to the absolute golden age of American aviation. In the 1950s, flying was not just transportation, it was an event. It was a luxurious, glamorous experience. Passengers dressed in their absolute best suits and elegant dresses to board these magnificent, shining silver machines. The sky was a vast, open frontier, and air travel was booming like never before. On this beautiful Saturday morning at Los Angeles International Airport, two of the absolute titans of the sky were preparing for departure. The first was Trans World Airlines Flight 2, a stunning, iconic Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, known for its elegant triple-tail design, carrying 70 passengers and crew heading toward Kansas City. Just 3 minutes behind it on the runway was United Airlines Flight 718, a powerful, state-of-the-art Douglas DC-7, carrying 58 souls bound for Chicago. They were two of the fastest, most advanced commercial aircraft in the entire world. But as they lifted off into the sunny California sky, climbing eastward over the Mojave Desert, neither the veteran pilots nor the excited passengers had any idea that they were flying into an invisible, deadly trap. To understand how two massive airplanes could possibly hit each other in the infinite vastness of the sky, you have to understand the terrifying reality of 1950s air traffic control. Today we take GPS and coast-to-coast radar completely for granted. But in 1956, commercial radar coverage only existed within a few dozen miles of major airports. Once a plane flew beyond the reach of the city, it essentially disappeared into a massive, uncontrolled void. The pilots navigated using radio beacons and standard compass headings. But most terrifyingly, they relied on a deeply flawed, outdated rule known as VFR or Visual Flight Rules. The core philosophy of VFR was simple and deadly: see and be seen. The pilots were completely responsible for simply looking out their windows to avoid hitting other planes. This primitive rule worked perfectly fine when biplanes were flying at 100 miles per hour in the 1920s. But now, these massive metal airliners were hurtling toward each other at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour. By the time a pilot saw another plane in their windshield, it was already far too late to turn. As both Flight 2 and Flight 718 cruised eastward over the barren deserts of California and Arizona, they encountered a massive, unexpected buildup of towering, anvil-shaped thunderclouds. TWA Captain Jack Gandy, trying to keep his passengers comfortable and avoid the severe turbulence, radioed the control center. He requested permission to climb to 21,000 feet. But the controller, staring at paper strips on a desk hundreds of miles away, denied the request because the United DC-7 was already occupying that exact altitude. Instead, Captain Gandy asked for clearance to fly 1,000 on top, meaning he would fly visually 1,000 feet above the cloud layer. The controller approved it but gave a chilling, routine warning: traffic is United DC-7. It was the last communication they would ever have. As the two massive airliners approached the borders of Arizona, they were flying over one of the most breathtaking, awe-inspiring natural wonders on the face of the earth, the Grand Canyon. In the 1950s, airlines actively encouraged their pilots to give their passengers a show. It was a highly common, entirely unwritten practice for pilots to deviate slightly from their strict, invisible airways to circle the canyon, tipping their massive silver wings so the passengers could take photographs of the mile-deep, painted gorges below. Both Captain Gandy in the TWA Constellation and Captain Robert Shirley in the United DC-7 were veteran pilots who loved showing off the canyon to their passengers. As they entered the airspace directly over the massive chasm, they found themselves navigating through a dangerous maze of towering, solid white cumulus clouds. Both planes were flying completely off their designated airways, playing a deadly game of blind man's bluff in the sky. Because they were flying under visual flight rules, they were entirely dependent on their own eyes. But the cockpits of 1950s airliners were not designed for maximum visibility. They had small, narrow windshields with massive metal pillars that created huge, devastating blind spots. The United DC-7, which was flying slightly faster, was approaching the TWA Constellation from behind and slightly to the right. To the pilots of the United Flight, the Constellation was perfectly hidden by their own windshield frame. And to the pilots of the TWA Flight, the United plane was completely invisible, hidden behind their right shoulder and the massive wings of their own aircraft. They were on a perfect, terrifying converging course, entirely blind to one another, flying directly over the deepest, most unforgiving terrain in North America. At exactly 10:31 in the morning, high above the rugged, ancient stone monoliths known as TWA Butte and Temple Butte, the invisible geometry of disaster finally intersected. Traveling at a combined closing speed of over 700 miles per hour, the two massive airliners collided in a catastrophic, deafening explosion of tearing aluminum and shattering glass. The left wing of the United DC-7 violently sliced directly through the iconic triple tail of the TWA constellation. The impact was absolutely devastating. The constellation, instantly stripped of its tail and all rear flight controls, violently pitched forward. It went into a terrifying, uncontrollable vertical dive, hurtling straight down toward the rocky floor of the canyon at a speed so immense that the structural integrity of the fuselage began to tear apart in the air. The United DC-7, having completely lost its left wing and experiencing a massive, explosive decompression, violently spiraled out of the sky. In less than a minute, both state-of-the-art passenger planes, representing the absolute pinnacle of human engineering, violently slammed into the unforgiving, solid rock walls of the Grand Canyon. The impacts were so catastrophic, so incredibly violent, that the resulting explosions echoed for miles through the deep, empty gorges, sending thick plumes of black smoke rising from the ancient, red rocks. Up in the control towers in Salt Lake City and Los Angeles, the radio operators called out to the flights. But there was only the cold, heavy static of the desert air. Both planes had completely, silently vanished from the world. When the planes failed to report their mandatory position checks, a massive, desperate search operation was immediately launched across the American Southwest. But because there was absolutely no radar data, no one knew exactly where to look. It wasn't until late that evening that two brothers who ran a small local scenic flight company spotted the terrifying, blackened scars on the sides of the cliffs deep within the canyon. The wreckage was located in some of the most incredibly remote, rugged, and entirely inaccessible terrain on the entire North American continent. The crash sites were separated by a deep, impassable gorge, with the TWA plane resting on Temple Butte and the United plane shattered against TWA Butte. When military helicopters and elite Swiss mountain climbers finally managed to reach the smoldering wreckage days later, the absolute horrifying scale of the tragedy became brutally apparent. The sheer violence of the impact and the subsequent fires had completely pulverized the massive aircraft. There were absolutely no survivors. All 128 innocent souls, men, women, and children who had been admiring the beautiful scenery just seconds before, were gone. At the time, it was the single deadliest commercial aviation disaster in the history of the world. The grueling, heartbreaking recovery operation took weeks, requiring brave men to scale sheer, vertical cliffs in blistering 120-degree desert heat just to recover the remains and tiny fragments of the aircraft to figure out how this impossible nightmare had actually happened. The recovery operation was so uniquely treacherous that the United States military had to call in elite Swiss mountain climbers just to reach the scattered debris. These incredibly brave men faced blistering 120-degree desert heat, sudden violent updrafts, and sheer, vertical drops of thousands of feet. They had to be lowered down by helicopters on thin steel cables just to access the narrow, jagged ledges where the shattered aluminum rested. Because the devastating force of the collision and the subsequent fires had made individual identification nearly impossible for many of the victims, a heartbreaking decision had to be made. Mass funerals were held. The unidentified passengers and crew of the United Airlines flight were buried together in a massive, solemn ceremony at the Grand Canyon Pioneer Cemetery, right on the edge of the magnificent, unforgiving abyss that claimed them. Meanwhile, the victims of the TWA flight were laid to rest in a beautiful mass grave in Flagstaff, Arizona. It was an unprecedented, communal mourning that brought the entire nation to a standstill, uniting the country in a shared, profound grief before the outrage set in. The Grand Canyon collision sent an absolute, paralyzing shockwave of terror through the American public. People were rightfully outraged. How could two massive, modern airliners simply bump into each other in a sky that was billions of cubic miles wide? The exhaustive federal investigation revealed the terrifying truth that the public had never known. The aviation industry had completely outgrown the outdated, primitive air traffic control system. The sky was fundamentally broken. But from this unimaginable tragedy came the most profound, life-saving revolution in the history of flight. The disaster forced the United States government to finally take decisive, massive action. In 1958, Congress passed the Federal Aviation Act, officially creating the Federal Aviation Agency, which we now know today as the FAA. The government invested hundreds of millions of dollars to modernize the sky. They mandated the immediate nationwide installation of radar systems so controllers could finally see planes from coast to coast. They entirely abolished the deadly see and be seen visual flight rules for commercial airliners, replacing it with mandatory positive instrument control. They also forced the airlines to install flight data recorders, the very first black boxes, into every single passenger plane. The 128 people who lost their lives over the Grand Canyon did not die in vain. Their tragedy directly built the incredibly safe, heavily monitored aviation system that protects millions of us every single time we step onto an airplane today. Now, I turn the question to you. Does knowing the incredibly dark history of aviation safety make you more or less nervous when you fly through the clouds? Let us know your thoughts and your own flying experiences in the comments below. And if you made it this far into the story, thank you so much for watching America Retold. Your history is America's history and we want to hear it.